I don't know if it's just me, but the thing which has affected me and worried me the most during this whole lockdown period has been the way the goalposts have moved quite steadily. The government goalposts, ever since March, the first lockdown, a year or so ago. It was that we were going to be locked down for our own good, first of all, to flatten the curve. Remember, there's a National Health Service. It can't always cope with all the things which are being thrown at it. We've always had a tight time over flu over the winter times anyway. But with this extra pandemic, it makes it difficult for the NHS to cope. So we must flatten the curve. We're not going to be able to stop the numbers, but we'll flatten the curve, and that means the NHS will cope with all those serious cases. It didn't take long, though, before we flattened the curve. The 3 weeks came and went, and we're still going to engage in lockdown of some kind or other. But this time it wasn't to flatten the curve. This time it was about the R number. Probably very few of us knew about R numbers before this pandemic occurred, but R number is the replication number. And if the replication number is more than 1, well, it means the virus is growing. And if the replication number is less than 1, it means the virus is decreasing. So it's the R number that counted from now on, no longer flattening the curve. As long as we can get the R number down below 0, below 1 I should say, and towards 0, then we'll be all right. Well, we did that too. We flattened the curve and we got the R number below 1. But wait a minute. It's not really about that. Goalpost moved again. Now it's about the number of deaths which are occurring. The number of deaths are naturally unacceptable. They're too high. Deaths of COVID, or rather with COVID, because we never did measure the number of deaths of COVID. Only those people who died really of any cause whatsoever were measured if they tested positive within 28 days. That was the number of deaths attributed to COVID. If we can get that number down, then we'll be all right. Then we can end lockdown. But it wasn't too long before the number of deaths did come down, so we had to switch again, and the goalpost moved from counting the number of deaths to counting the number of infections. The number of infections continued to increase, possibly because the number of tests which were implemented now included pretty well everybody in the country and twice a week. Hardly surprising that the number of infections still seemed to be quite high, especially as many of those might even be positive, false positives as it's called. Anyway, that was the next thing. And then when we've got the number of infections down, it seems the goalposts are moving yet again. And the goalposts are moving to the number of people who have been vaccinated, all the vulnerable people who have been vaccinated. And when that's been done, then we can end lockdown. Well, we come and we've been fantastically successful at vaccinating vulnerable people. Everyone who's vulnerable has all now been offered 1 or 2 doses of the vaccine. That's all been happening. But still we have lockdown, and still the goalposts are moving. Now it seems that we'll need to probably keep lockdown until we can get a kind of vaccine passport or a certificate to allow us to do things. And I guess that's probably my biggest worry of all. We never have been a country where we carried papers about. But whenever you have a law, you should always ask yourself this question. Not how good could the law be, but how bad could it be? How could it be used to people's disadvantage if someone took it into their head to do so? That's always been the real test of how you implement laws, not whether they'll be used by a nice and kind and benign person, but whether they'll be used by someone for the wrong kind of purposes. We've seen it many times. The law against terrorism. That was a good idea at the first instance. We don't like terrorists and we need to have strong laws to combat terrorism. But then it didn't take long before you found somewhere like Poole Council using exactly the same law to spy on parents, just in case they claimed to live in a catchment area for a particular school they wanted to send their kids to when they didn't actually live there. We can use the terrorism laws to monitor that. And you see how things can be used, and often are used, more often than not used, in ways which you never intended. And that's the problem with vaccine passports, showing your papers as it used to be known in the old days. At the moment, the idea is, oh, you'll need a vaccine passport to get into a sports ground, or maybe to get into a museum or some public area like that. And that all sounds terribly reasonable. But how could it be misused? How could it go? What could it be used for? Well, I suppose that's the kind of thing that worries me. Because it wouldn't take much to say, well, now that it's been successful in sports grounds and big events like that, you'll need to show your vaccine certificate or passport to get into large shopping malls maybe, or even to hotels. And then it won't be a bit of a small step to move to that to say, well, you can't go to a supermarket now, or you can't use public transport or any transport at all, except your own maybe, if you don't have some kind of vaccine passport. And then you can then say, well, maybe we don't allow people into various shops. Maybe you can't make use of a bank. Maybe you can't make use of a building society. Maybe you have limited access to your cash. Maybe you can no longer buy petrol anymore. Maybe you can no longer even buy a bottle of water anymore. Supposing you were to attach all these things, your freedom to move is now given to you by a passport which the government can validate or invalidate as it sees fit. And I suppose the biggest moving goalpost for me, which summarises the whole problem here, is the moving goalposts of people's rights. In the past, and before COVID, BC you might want to call it, I suppose, in the BC era, it used to be the case that human rights, your right to free movement, to walk around a park, to sit on a park bench, unmolested, to go where you like, to do as you pleased, that used to be called an inalienable human right. It used to be a right which could not be taken away from you, inalienable. It was yours by virtue of being a human being. But now the biggest shift of all, and the biggest move of all the goalposts, is to shift that right away from you and seemingly give it to the government. So the government tells you now whether you can go for a walk in the park, who you can associate with, what you can do, whether you can sit down, whether you can't sit down, whose friends you can meet, who you can have round your house or who you can't have round your house. All these things used to be rights which we had ourselves. And now, well, you can have them if the government graciously says you can have them. And that for me has been the biggest shift of goalposts that this whole pandemic hysteria has brought about. The shift of human rights away from the individual and vesting them in a benign and benevolent government who will give them back to you if it feels like it, if it feels that you deserve it, if it feels that you've done the right thing to merit it. No longer do we seem to have rights of our own anymore. We need to ask the government to be able to walk in a park or even to shop in a supermarket. And that is the kind of thing that keeps me awake at night.